I think it's important at this point just to not to speak ill of the dead, but because of media and mainstream movies and things of that nature, John Tunstall is typically portrayed as this good guy. He wanted to come in and rid the county of the monopoly that L.G. Murphy, Jimmy Dolan, and John Riley had over the county. In reality, he wanted to replace them. He's very clear in his letters that he wants to start his own ring. He wants to replace them and be that person. The big difference is, and he'll find this out shortly there after starting his store, he was not necessarily willing to resort to violence. The others were. And that was really what set them apart. He, right into the end, probably the reason he died on February 18th was because he was still believing in the legal avenues that were available to him. And they just continuously failed him. We'll talk a little bit about that. So, John Tunstall gets into legal trouble through his business associates. The Santa Fe Ring had a lot of different mechanisms by which they could destroy somebody. The legal system was probably their best and their favorite because they had in their pocket people like Warren Bristol and William Reinerson, who are attorney generals or district attorneys in the territory. John Tunstall's business partner, not on paper but by handshake, Alexander McSween, gets into legal trouble with L.G. Murphy and Company, predominantly because of squabbling over the insurance policy for this man, Emil Fritz, who was L.G. Murphy's original business partner. He dies, and he has an insurance policy that needs to be collected. Alexander McSween is actually the lawyer for L.G. Murphy and Company, and before they have a falling out, he's collected over $30,000 worth of debts for them. So he's a good debt-collecting lawyer. That was his specialty. They have a falling out over this insurance policy, largely because while McSween is trying to collect the insurance policy, he's also trying to, circumnavigate the house and L.G. Murphy and basically take over their businesses. So in the end, he manages to collect the full amount. The actual, the money itself, the question of who it goes to, the heirs, becomes an issue. And John Tunstall is just right in the middle of this entire problem. At the same time, the Santa Fe Ring is going after John Chisholm. John Chisholm is smart, though. He basically gets rid of all of his assets. He divests himself of all of his assets. He sells his entire herd to a large cattle company called Hunter and Evans. So now, technically, he's running cattle for somebody else. Most of his fixed assets in this territory of New Mexico he signs over to his brothers. So he kind of removes himself from the ability of the Santa Fe Ring to come after him legally. Alexander McSween, not so much. So, and again, John Tunstall was right in the middle of this because he's associated with both of these men. So, by January of 1878, McSween and Chisholm decided they need to leave the territory. They do so perfectly legally. In fact, McSween, because there's a lawsuit against him from L.G. Murphy and Company about this Fritz estate, he lets Warren Bristol know that he's leaving the territory, what he was supposed to do, and they head up to Las Vegas to catch a train heading east. And McSween and Chisholm are arrested on pretty much trumped up charges, especially in the case of Chisholm. They use some really obscure territorial legal thing to keep him in the territory. McSween posts bond and decides he's going to go to Mesilla and have a hearing about this whole thing and just sort it out in the legal system. Chisholm, again, being the smart one, doesn't pay his bond and remains in prison until March of 1878, basically during all the explosion of the beginning of the Lincoln County War. So he basically takes himself out of the violent period that's about to erupt and stays there for a while. So again, Tunstall is right in the middle of this. They head down in January or the early February of 1878. They head down to Mesilla for a hearing with Judge Warren Bristol. And this is one of the strangest hearings that has ever occurred in the territory. First of all, it was held in Warren Bristol's house, which is a little odd, presumably because he was recovering from maybe a bout of smallpox, which was ravaging the territory at the time. Also, nobody was forced or required to swear an oath, so they were not under oath at the time. And there was no documentation. Nobody was writing anything down. That was the biggest issue. And that's where John Tunstall really ran into trouble, because he goes to this hearing in Mesilla along with other people, and he testifies. And there's two very distinctive stories that come out of this. One side says that John Tunstall says, I am business partners with Alexander McSween. And that's a big problem because in the eyes of the law, that now means that McSween's property is Tunstall's property and vice versa. The other side of the story is he says the exact opposite. And even the deputy that is in charge of basically moving McSween around the territory at the time, a guy named Adolphe Berrier, says that Tunstall, in his affidavit that's given later, says that Tunstall said the exact opposite. I'm not business partners with Alexander McSween. We do not have a formal business. Regardless, the court heard what they wanted to hear. And at basically the same time this hearing is finished with no resolution, it's postponed to the next period court in April in Lincoln. The heirs of Emil Fritz come to Messia and they swear an affidavit that Alexander McSween owes them money. And what this allows the court to do is to rush ahead of Tunstall and McSween back to Lincoln and put a writ of attachment on their property to make up for that money that they are saying that they owe him. And the amount is relatively small, but Sheriff William Brady begins attaching the property to the extent of about $40,000, essentially the entire Tunstall store. So John Tunstall shows back up in town, and these men are basically taking his property, even down to his family photographs. So there's a big argument about whether or not his property is that of McSween's and whether or not they're business partners. So the store itself is kind of left alone, but then he has other property, namely his cattle, which is down in his Feliz ranch. So a posse is put together and they are sent to the ranch to attach the cattle that are there. Initially, the posse is turned away on February 10th. The foreman of the ranch, Dick Brewer, and others who are there say, no, you don't understand, this is not Alexander McSween's property. And John Tunstall's property is not his property. And they require basically that they get a court order or something from Tunstall that says, yes, give them the cattle. So without incident, they leave. But they're brought back. They go down the Seven Rivers along the Pecos. They raise a bigger posse. And they come back. The man on the left is J.B. Matthews, who's kind of the head of the posse. And the man on the right is Dick Brewer, Richard M. Brewer, who was the foreman of Tunstall's ranch at the time. So on February 18th, they come back. But when they get there, there's nobody there except the cook, Godfrey Goss, who's there at the ranch. What had happened was John Tunstall heard that this posse was coming back. He gets back to Lincoln. He rides all the way down to John Chisholm's ranch to ask for help from his cowboys. John Chisholm is not there because he's sitting in a jail in Las Vegas, smartly, at that point, completely out of the situation. His brother Jim Chisholm says, I'm not going to help you. We're not going to give any of our Jingle Bob cowboys to you to get involved with this at the time. So Tunstall then rides all the way on February 17th from Roswell to his ranch along the Rio Feliz. A huge amount of time in the saddle. So by the time he gets there on the evening of February 17th, he's been in the saddle for almost well over 24 hours and ridden well over 200 miles. So he had to be extremely tired. He wakes up the next morning about 8:30, and here's what he tells his cowboys. He says, look, let them have the cattle. The deal is they got to stay here. We're going to leave a representative. He sends one of his cowboys, a guy named William McCloskey, to go get somebody else from the Seven Rivers posses to say, look, you leave a representative here, I'll leave a representative here, and we'll let the legal system work it out. But I'm going to take my horses with me. And the horse situation had already been finalized. The horses were not part of the attachment. He had worked that out with William Brady, the sheriff, already here in Lincoln. So he takes a number of his cowboys, including William Bonney, John Middleton, Richard Brewer, Fred Waite. They head up the canyon or head up towards Lincoln on the morning of February 18th. So the posse gets to Tunstall Ranch not very long after they leave. And Godfrey Goss tells them exactly what John Tunstall said about the cattle, and a sub-posse is formed. And this sub-posse, on the orders of Jimmy Dolan, you track down and ostensibly take the horses back, which are not part of the detachment. There's no warrant for the arrest of John Tunstall. He has no real legal right to even go after them. Among the members of this posse are a bunch of people from the Seven Rivers area, some from Lincoln, but at the last minute, 3 men, known outlaws, members of the Boys, the rustling gang that operates here in Lincoln, joined the posse. Jesse Evans, Frank Baker, and Tom Hill. And these 3 men are known outlaws. They joined the posse. They're never officially listed as the posse, but they are there nonetheless. So, there's no doubt in my mind that John Tunstall and his cowboys are not in any hurry to get up back to Lincoln. Because as far as John Tunstall is concerned, he's done nothing wrong. The horses aren't part of the attachment. He doesn't need a hurry. So they're moving along, and about 5 o'clock that night, they're overtaken by the posse, and John Tunstall is killed. We'll leave that story there. We'll talk more about the details when we get up to the murder site. But the aftermath of this whole thing is pretty amazing. The death of John Tunstall, it can be argued that the Lincoln County War had been brewing for years, and that's absolutely true. And it can be argued that it went on after even Billy the Kid was killed in 1881. But the death of John Tunstall did spark the largest and most condensed period of violence in the Lincoln County War. And more importantly, probably, what it did was it alerted the federal government as to the issues that were going on in territorial New Mexico. So, largely because John Tunstall was a British citizen, as soon as he dies, letters start flying all over the world, to Canada, to England, to his parents, and eventually to Washington, D.C. And very quickly, the British ambassador or minister to the United States, Edward Thornton, gets involved. And all of a sudden, Rutherford B. Hayes and the Secretary of State and the Attorney General for the United States, they're starting to get letters on their desk from the minister saying, hey, your territorial officials were complicit and involved in the murder of one of our citizens. That's a pretty serious offense. It's not just saying he was killed here, it's saying that your territorial officials were involved in the murder of one of our citizens. And that leads to a series of investigations. Probably the most important here in Lincoln involves a special investigator named Frank Warner Angel. He comes here during the summer of 1878 and takes down information related to all sorts of corruption that's going on in the state, but largely here in Lincoln County. And that information that I gave you guys those are affidavits taken during the Angel report. He goes back, he submits his report to the Attorney General and the President of the United States, and it largely is the reasoning for the removal of a number of territorial officials in the fall of 1878, including Samuel Axtell, the territorial government, who was replaced by Lew Wallace, the new territorial government. So the murder of John Tunstall led directly to that. Not to mention the bloody and violent period of the Lincoln County War that happened between February of 1878 and the 5-day battle here in Lincoln in July of 1878, and the death of Alexander McSween as well.